Hello again. Welcome back to the Wars Primer. This time we want to take a look at the Wars role-playing game from Mongoose Publishing, the RPG. Now, of course, as I mentioned previously, the Wars franchise began with the TCG, or the trading card game from Decipher Inc. However, much of the expansion into that universe, beyond the lore that connected the different cards together, and some of the short stories that were used to launch it off, which we'll talk about in the next Primer episode here, a lot of the development took place within the role-playing game. It's a type of medium that allows for a lot of exposition, a lot of explanation, and a lot of new backstory to either be created or revealed. And in that case, Mongoose Publishing did a very good job of pushing out a lot of great information about where the Wars franchise came from, where the storyline itself had its origins. In fact, much of what I discussed on the History of Wars Primer, the very first part of this Primer series, actually came, in most respects, not from the card game, but from the role-playing game. So, who is Mongoose Publishing? Mongoose Publishing is an RPG publisher that's been in business since around 2001, ironically the same year that Decipher lost the Star Wars CCG license that set the stage for the launch of the Wars TCG with the same game mechanics later on. Mongoose Publishing is a Great Britain company, or a British company. They are known for a lot of their different role-playing games, some licensed, some's not. Things like Traveler or RuneQuest, Babylon 5, Starship Troopers, Paranoia, Conan. They've done a lot of different RPGs. And they decided to take their shot at doing an RPG based on the exciting Wars universe that had had the groundwork laid in the TCG. Unfortunately, just like the TCG ended after only 2 sets of cards, Incursion and Nowhere to Hide, we found the RPG end with only 3 publications. Well, sort of 3. Maybe 3.5, but we'll get to that part. The game started out with a core Wars rulebook. Right here, the Wars role-playing game. Everything you needed to know to play Wars could be found in here. You didn't necessarily need to find any of the other supplements, though, frankly, the other supplements are quite good. This one didn't spend a lot of time talking about individual characters within the Wars universe. It dealt with the technology. It dealt with how to create characters, how to play the game, weapons, things like that. However, for those of you who are interested in the background of Wars, there is a wonderful section in the back of the book. I'm in the middle of it, but I'm flipping back to the beginning, called Factions of Wars. Tons of great in-universe Wars history for all of the different factions, all 5 of them, plus some details that you won't get anywhere else. This made for a very interesting book in that it focused mostly on gameplay and setting up the ability to really get into the Wars universe, to make the universe your own, rather than being thrown a whole bunch of pre-created characters, while at the same time giving us tons of great background information. At the time, this used to retail about $45, $44.95. But back then, that was about on par with the starter books for a whole lot of RPGs, especially ones imported into the United States. So this is a pretty good find. You can find these still on eBay every now and then. Eventually, they decided to create a new supplement that would add to the universe, give us more weapons, more technology, especially more about the geography of the solar system and the different moons and planets and such within the Wars time frame. Plus, introduce us to some of the core characters that we saw in, for instance, the card game. That was a supplement called Battlefront. Now, Battlefront was an interesting one. Again, it gives you quite a bit of information in here that is in-universe. They take that idea of the Factions of Wars and create a new section for those of you who are interested in the saga of Wars, the history of it, called History and the Factions, which gave even more details than the previous Wars RPG starter book had. This is where you could find information, for instance, about the individual gangs of the Mavericks, the individual segments of society on Earth, like the corporations, or society on Gonjan, the different groups within Shi and Kuei society. It also, as I mentioned, finally started to introduce some of the actual characters from the game and RPG stats for them. You notice here at the top, that gentleman there is the protagonist of Jim Perry's upcoming Maverick novella, a gentleman by the name of Jack Wilgris. Jack Wilgris gets some background information here and RPG stats, but he's not a character created for the RPG. They're bringing in characters out of the card game and giving them more detail. So it sort of created more background for the Wars universe while at the same time developing things that already existed in the Wars universe. A very good supplement. I wouldn't recommend trying to play the game with just Battlefront. You're going to need the original role-playing game rulebook to be able to play it. However, if you have this, getting Battlefront is pretty much a no-brainer. But all of these were about statistics. All of these were about weapons, technology, characters, creation of characters, playing the game. Not a lot in the way of giving you an adventure to play through. They sort of left it up to you, and your game master, as the case may be, to create your own scenarios. For those who wanted something that was created ahead of time, either to practice with, to get into because they didn't want to create their own, or what have you, they did create one adventure supplement named after the original card set. You may recall the original card set was Incursion. Well, we have the Wars Incursion Adventure. It's smaller. This one's paperback. It's not nearly as thick as the previous ones. It is still all color on the inside. It takes you through an adventure based around mostly characters out of the first TCG set, although there are some elements brought in from later materials as well. It makes for an interesting adventure, gets you involved with the Mavericks and some intrigue behind the scenes, but it's definitely a very Maverick-centered type of adventure. Perhaps Earth-censured because they didn't like it, or Earth-censored. Maybe you couldn't find this in the Earther camp during the time period. But it's called Incursion. This is the only adventure book released, unfortunately. However, we do know there was another one that was in the works at the time, though it unfortunately never saw release, as the back of the Wars Incursion adventure book includes a promo for Nowhere to Hide as another adventure book. And of course, Nowhere to Hide, for those who don't recall, was the name of the second TCG set. The idea was apparently to have adventure books to tie into each of the card sets, whereas Battlefront and other supplements would add to the universe and tie into characters and such, whereas the original game was meant to be able to be played as a standalone if you liked creating your own characters and scenarios from scratch. Interestingly enough, because of the fact that this series ended so early, it became one that's actually somewhat easy to collect. The original book, as I mentioned, was $44.95 retail. The supplement, Battlefront, was $29.95 retail, and the adventure book was $14.95 retail, Incursion. At this point, you can usually find these. Well, I say usually as in you can usually find 2 out of 3 of these on eBay at any given time. It's not that any one is more rare than the others, it's just that it seems like, as I've been looking, as research for this, and finding Wars materials for those people who know I'm writing for it and are interested in it, I found that usually you'll find 2 at any given time, but then you'll have to wait for the other one to pop up. But it seems almost as if they rotate, as if fate is somehow making sure that those of you out there who want to get the Wars materials can still find it. There's also a little bit more Wars materials out there. Remember I said there was sort of 3.5 RPG books out there. They were originally going to make another book called Soul and Steel, but it never got produced. However, all the material was ready to go. Mongoose Publishing has its own magazine called Signs and Portents, and eventually it wound up being available only in e-zine form, whatever you want to call it, PDF, Adobe Acrobat form, downloadable online from Mongoose Publishing's website. Within numerous editions of Signs and Portents, you'll find articles for Wars with new Wars information that were originally meant to be sections in Soul and Steel. So we sort of got a chance to see a 4th RPG book, though not in actual RPG book form that we could, of course, handle physically. Instead, we'd have to go and pick up Signs and Portents, all those different issues, downloadable free off of their website, to get that same information. So, It was a great attempt to add more to the Wars universe, gave us lots of great backstory, new canon, new continuity, which is great for us who are writing the novellas and the comics and such now. But unfortunately, much like the Wars card game, it wound up dying ahead of its time. This is a great storyline, and I'm very happy to see that we're finally able to pick it back up again. Of course, we're not the first to write prose fiction in the Wars universe. That honor belongs to authors like Michael Stackpole, whom you may know from Battletech or Star Wars or his original novels out there. How do they figure in? How does the old fiction figure in with the new fiction? That we'll talk about in the final of our 4-part Wars Primer series.